Hi there, my name is Latin. Welcome to our channel where we uncover the most chilling true crime stories. Today, we're taking you to the icy town of Glacier Ridge, where a body found frozen under the ice reveals dark secrets buried for years. Stay with us as we dive into the mystery of Clara Avery's disappearance and the shocking truth behind her death. In the far reaches of Alaska, where snow blankets the landscape for months, lies the small town of Glacier Ridge. It's a place where isolation defines life, and winter's icy grip tightens with every passing day. The people here are resilient, accustomed to long, dark winters and the frozen silence that surrounds them. On most days, Glacier Ridge is a quiet town where nothing much happens. But on November 10th, 2022, that quiet was shattered. Roy Pender, a local ice fisherman, made his way to Iceborne Lake for what he thought would be a typical morning. The sun had barely risen, and the air was biting cold. His breath hung in the stillness as he drilled a hole into the thick ice. What Roy found beneath the ice that morning would haunt the town for weeks to come. As he peered into the opening, something unusual caught his eye. It wasn't a fish or a sunken object. It was the outline of a body, perfectly preserved under the frozen surface. Shock coursed through him as he realized what he was seeing. He hurried back to town, reporting his discovery to the local authorities. Glacier Ridge was no stranger to tragedy, but the body beneath the ice stirred something deeper, a sense that the past was clawing its way back. When investigators arrived, they extracted the frozen remains. The body, identified as a woman, had been lost beneath the ice for over 15 years. This wasn't just a random accident. The woman found under Iceborne Lake had a name, Clara Avery, and her death was no mystery to everyone. The town quickly turned its focus to two women, June Holloway and Harper Lindstrom. The estranged stepsisters hadn't spoken in years, but both had recently returned to Glacier Ridge for their father's funeral. The discovery of Clara Avery's body was about to force them to confront secrets they thought were long buried. June Holloway stood at the back of the small funeral home in Glacier Ridge, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. She hadn't been back here in years. The town had too many painful memories she tried hard to forget. Quiet and introverted, June was always the one who kept to herself, choosing silence over confrontation. She hadn't spoken to her stepsister Harper in more than a decade. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a gap neither had been willing to cross. Now they were both back in town, drawn together by the death of their father. June had returned out of obligation. It wasn't something she wanted to do, but there was a sense of duty that brought her to Glacier Ridge for the funeral. As she stood alone, she felt the weight of the years between her and Harper. Harper Lindstrom arrived late, making her entrance with a tense energy that seemed to fill the room. Harper was everything June wasn't, sharp-tongued, impulsive, and never one to back down from a fight. She had a way of saying things that cut deep, and June had learned long ago that it was best to avoid confrontation with her. As Harper walked in, their eyes met briefly, but neither said a word. The tension was palpable. There was no embrace, no shared grief, just a cold acknowledgement of each other's presence. June could feel Harper's eyes on her, and she knew what her stepsister was thinking. The same thoughts had likely been circling Harper's mind for years. The unresolved anger, the blame, the unspoken accusations about what happened that night. June and Harper's relationship had never recovered from the events of their teenage years. They had once been close, inseparable even, but something had shattered that bond. Now, standing on opposite sides of the room, the silence between them was as thick as the snow outside. The funeral proceeded, but June barely heard the words. Her thoughts kept drifting to the past, to the night that changed everything. She couldn't help but wonder if Harper still blamed her for what happened to Clara Avery. Clara had been a part of their lives, and now, after so many years, her body had resurfaced, bringing with it a flood of memories June had long tried to suppress. 15 years earlier, the town of Glacier Ridge was a different place. It was the night of the senior prom, a night most teenagers looked forward to, but for June and Harper, it would be the night that everything changed. June and Harper, though stepsisters, had always been close. They grew up together after their parents married, and they were each other's best friends. But that bond would be tested on the night of September 15th, 2007. Harper was excited for prom, not just for the dance, but for what was happening afterward. She had been invited to an exclusive after-party at Clara Avery's cabin near Iceborne Lake. Clara, 5 years older, was the town's rebellious figure, known for her wild side and for attracting attention wherever she went. Harper admired her confidence and carefree attitude, while June had always been more cautious. June didn't trust Clara. She felt something was off about her, and she was worried about Harper's fascination with her. But Harper insisted they go to the party. "Don't be boring, June," Harper had said, her usual sharpness cutting through. "It'll be fun. You can't hide forever." Reluctantly, June agreed. The two sisters, still dressed in their prom gowns, made their way to Clara's cabin, where the night took a dark turn. Clara's cabin was nestled deep in the woods by Iceborne Lake, far from the town's quiet streets. The party was small, with just a handful of people, but the atmosphere was tense. Clara was in a mood that night, drinking too much, saying things that made everyone uncomfortable. June wanted to leave almost immediately, but Harper was entranced by Clara's wild energy. Harper ignored June's quiet warnings, pushing her away, both figuratively and literally. As the night wore on, Clara's behavior grew erratic. She pulled Harper aside, speaking in hushed tones that June couldn't quite hear. Something about the way Clara looked at June made her stomach turn. There was something dangerous in her eyes, something threatening. Then, at some point during the night, Clara and Harper disappeared from the group. June tried to find them, walking through the cabin and eventually stepping outside into the cold, dark woods. The silence of the night was unsettling. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. June eventually found Harper by the lake's edge, standing alone. Her dress was dirty, and her expression was blank, almost haunted. Clara was nowhere to be seen. When June asked where Clara had gone, Harper didn't answer right away. She just stared at the frozen lake, her eyes distant. "I don't know," Harper finally whispered. "She's gone." Panic washed over June. The night had taken a dark and unexpected turn, and now Clara Avery was missing. Despite the sisters' best efforts to search the area, Clara was never found. The party quickly dissolved, and the mystery of Clara's disappearance hung over the town like a dark cloud. June left town the very next day. The weight of that night and what had happened by the lake was too much to bear. Harper stayed behind, unwilling to let go of the anger and confusion that came from Clara's sudden disappearance. The bond between the sisters was shattered that night, and they hadn't spoken since. But now, with Clara's body recovered from Iceborne Lake, the past had come back to haunt them both. The discovery of Clara Avery's body reawakened long-dormant suspicions in Glacier Ridge. After 15 years, the town had moved on, or at least tried to. But the frozen corpse pulled from Iceborne Lake brought everything back into sharp focus. The local police, overwhelmed by the complexity of the case, called in an outside investigator to lead the new inquiry. Enter Detective Elliot Granger. Detective Granger knew that the answers lay in the evidence. Clara Avery's body had been frozen beneath the ice for 15 years, preserving more than just her remains. The next step was crucial, uncovering what the body could tell them that the witnesses couldn't. The local coroner, Dr. Lynn Becker, had examined Clara's body in detail. When Granger received the report, the findings were more revealing than he'd expected. Clara hadn't died from drowning or hypothermia, as some had initially thought. The cause of death was clear. She had been strangled. The marks on her neck were faint but unmistakable. Whoever had killed her wanted to make sure she was silenced. What shocked Granger most wasn't just the manner of her death, but what was found on her clothes. Clara's dress still had traces of a distinct perfume, one that Dr. Becker recognized immediately. It was a rare, expensive brand, sold only in exclusive boutiques. This clue pointed to someone with money, someone who wasn't just part of Glacier Ridge's everyday crowd. Alongside the perfume, Dr. Becker found a small strand of hair on Clara's clothing. It wasn't hers. It was lighter, a shade that didn't match Clara's own dark hair. The hair sample was sent for DNA testing, but even without confirmation, Granger knew this was a breakthrough. The physical evidence was pointing to someone close to Clara, someone who had been with her the night she died. Granger's thoughts returned to Simon Drexler. The perfume was known to be favored by Drexler's late wife, a woman who had passed away a few years before Clara's disappearance. The connection was impossible to ignore. Could Clara have been involved with Drexler in ways that went beyond business? But the detective couldn't rule out the Holloway sisters just yet. The tension between them, especially Harper's obsession with Clara, still troubled him. It was clear that Clara had been playing a dangerous game, balancing her connections with multiple people, some of whom had a lot to lose if she exposed their secrets. The forensic evidence opened new possibilities. Granger now had physical proof that Clara's death was no accident. But the question remained, who had put her under the ice? And why did she have to die? The next step would be to follow these new leads, hoping they would bring him closer to the truth that had stayed frozen in Glacier Ridge for far too long. Granger was a seasoned detective, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to solve cold cases that others had given up on. He arrived in Glacier Ridge just days after Clara's body was found, ready to piece together the fragments of a mystery that had haunted the town for years. His first task was simple: find out who Clara Avery really was in the months leading up to her disappearance, and who had the most to gain from her silence. He knew the answers wouldn't come easy, especially from a town like Glacier Ridge, where secrets were as thick as the snow. Detective Granger started by interviewing the two people who seemed most connected to the case, June Holloway and Harper Lindstrom. The two stepsisters were now back in town for their father's funeral, but their connection to Clara Avery couldn't be ignored. June was the first to sit down with the detective. She was visibly uncomfortable, her hands fidgeting as she spoke. Granger noticed how carefully she chose her words, as if she was tiptoeing around something bigger. June explained that she hadn't been close to Clara and that her memories of the night Clara disappeared were hazy at best. But Granger could tell there was more. Her quiet demeanor hinted at years of guilt and unresolved conflict. When Granger pressed her about what happened the night of the prom, June's answers were vague. She admitted to feeling uneasy about Clara, but insisted she didn't know what had caused her to vanish. The more June spoke, the more Granger was certain she was hiding something that went beyond a missing girl. Next, Granger turned his attention to Harper. She was different from June in almost every way. Where June was reserved, Harper was bold. She met Granger's questions head-on, without hesitation, but there was an edge to her responses, a sharpness that suggested deep resentment. "It's June you should be talking to," Harper said, her eyes flashing with anger. "She's the one who left town the day after Clara went missing. I stayed. I wanted answers. She didn't." Granger noted the bitterness in Harper's voice. It wasn't just about Clara. It was about their broken relationship. But Harper was quick to point out that Clara had been a major influence in their lives, particularly hers. She idolized Clara's rebellious spirit and her ability to live without caring what others thought. But the more she talked about Clara, the more Granger realized that Harper's admiration bordered on obsession. Harper blamed June for their shattered bond, and in some ways for Clara's disappearance. She seemed convinced that June knew more than she was letting on. Granger filed that information away, but knew it wasn't enough to prove anything. What struck Granger most about the interviews was how both sisters spoke about Clara in different ways. To Harper, Clara was a symbol of freedom and rebellion. To June, she was a threat, someone dangerous. This stark contrast in how they saw Clara led Granger to dig deeper into the past. The police investigation from 15 years ago had been inconclusive. Clara's disappearance was treated as a runaway case at first. But now, with her body pulled from the lake, it was clear that foul play had been involved all along. Granger's suspicions grew when he learned more about Clara's final days. Through old town records and interviews with locals, he uncovered that Clara had been involved with someone much older and far more powerful than anyone had realized. Clara had been entangled in a complicated relationship with Simon Drexler, a business associate of June and Harper's father. Drexler had long been a shadowy figure in Glacier Ridge, known for his influence and his ability to keep secrets. Granger began to piece together a picture of Clara's life that few had seen. Clara had known things about Drexler's dealings, and possibly even things about the Holloway family. The more Granger uncovered, the more it seemed that Clara's death was no accident. The key now was to find out why Clara's body had been placed under the ice. Who wanted her gone? Was it Drexler, protecting his business interests, or was it someone closer to Clara's circle? The investigation was just beginning, but one thing was certain. Clara's death wasn't just a random tragedy. It was part of something far more sinister, something that had been buried in the cold, silent town of Glacier Ridge for far too long. With the forensic evidence pointing in new directions, Detective Granger felt the case starting to crack open. Clara Avery's murder wasn't random. It was personal, and now Granger needed to dig deeper into the lives of the people who had been closest to her. The first person Granger focused on was Simon Drexler. Drexler had always been a powerful figure in Glacier Ridge, wealthy, influential, and known for keeping his hands in shady business deals. Clara had been involved with Drexler in the months before she disappeared. Old town records showed that Clara worked briefly as an assistant at Drexler's real estate firm, but Granger suspected there was more to their relationship than business. Digging into Clara's personal belongings, Granger uncovered a journal she kept hidden in her cabin, which had been left untouched since her disappearance. The entries painted a picture of a woman torn between fear and ambition. Clara had been gathering information, dangerous information, about Drexler's illegal dealings. She hinted at using this knowledge to get ahead, but there were also notes that showed she was scared. One entry, written just days before she vanished, read, "I know too much. If I don't get out soon, they'll come for me." This revelation shifted the focus to Drexler. Clara's notes suggested that she planned to confront him, but Granger knew that a man as powerful as Drexler wouldn't have tolerated someone like Clara threatening his empire. Drexler had the means and the motive to make sure Clara never spoke again. But something didn't sit right with Granger. While Drexler was certainly involved, the forensic evidence, particularly the perfume and hair sample, suggested that someone else had been with Clara in her final moments. As Granger continued to investigate, he turned his attention back to June and Harper Holloway. The sisters' connection to Clara was undeniable, and the tension between them grew stronger with every new piece of information. Harper's intense admiration for Clara had always struck Granger as odd, but it wasn't until he discovered another hidden truth that things began to fall into place. June, the quiet and withdrawn sister, had been hiding something all along. After multiple interviews and mounting pressure, June finally cracked. She admitted that on the night Clara disappeared, she had witnessed an argument between Clara and their father, Richard Holloway. June had seen them by the lake, arguing heatedly, but she had left before the situation escalated. That was the last time she saw Clara alive. Richard Holloway had always been a respected figure in Glacier Ridge, but June's confession cast a dark shadow over his legacy. It appeared that Richard had been more involved in Clara's life than anyone had known. June confessed that her father had a long-running affair with Clara, one that neither Harper nor the rest of the town had known about. Clara had been planning to expose the affair and the financial dealings between Richard and Drexler. That, June believed, was the real reason Clara was killed. But this wasn't just about Richard Holloway's secrets. Granger realized that June had kept quiet all these years, not only to protect her father, but because she too had been involved. After witnessing the argument, June left the lake, but she admitted that she had seen Clara's lifeless body the next morning. Fearful of what her father might have done, June kept her mouth shut and left town, choosing silence over the truth. Harper, on the other hand, had no idea about their father's affair with Clara. When Granger confronted her with June's confession, Harper's shock was evident. She had idolized Clara, but now, learning that Clara had been involved with her father, her world came crashing down. The sister who had spent years blaming June for abandoning her was now faced with a new, more painful reality. The woman she had admired had been deeply entangled in their family's darkest secrets. Despite June's confession, Granger knew there was still one more piece missing. The forensic evidence suggested that Simon Drexler played a direct role in Clara's death. June's confession placed her father at the scene of the argument, but it was Drexler who stood to lose the most if Clara exposed his business dealings. The connection between Clara's knowledge of Drexler's secrets and her death was undeniable. The case was no longer just a cold mystery. It was a tangled web of lies, power, and betrayal, with Clara caught in the middle. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Granger knew that Clara's death was the result of more than one person's actions. It was a conspiracy to keep Glacier Ridge's deepest secrets buried beneath the ice. Detective Granger had uncovered the truth piece by piece, but the case was far from over. With June's confession about her father's affair and Simon Drexler's involvement in Clara's life, the picture was clearer, but justice hadn't yet been served. Granger knew that Simon Drexler was still out there, alive, powerful, and dangerous. Drexler hadn't left Glacier Ridge. In fact, he had returned to his estate after hearing rumors that the investigation was closing in on him. Granger wasted no time. He and a team of officers arrived at Drexler's mansion late one night, ready to confront him once and for all. As they approached the sprawling property, Granger felt the tension in the air. Drexler had always been one step ahead, but now, with Clara's journal and the forensic evidence, Granger had what he needed to bring him down. Inside the house, Drexler was waiting. Calm, collected, and dressed in a tailored suit, he greeted Granger with a cold smile. "I was expecting you," he said, his voice smooth but laced with arrogance. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't planning on going down without a fight. Granger wasted no time. He laid out the evidence, the DNA, the perfume, and Clara's notes about Drexler's illegal dealings. Drexler listened, his expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed like he would deny everything, but instead he smirked. "You don't know how deep this goes, Detective," Drexler said, his tone chilling. "Clara was playing a dangerous game. She got too close, and she paid the price." Granger's eyes narrowed. "She was going to expose you. You couldn't let her live." Drexler didn't flinch. "She thought she could control me. No one controls me." With those words, Drexler sealed his fate. The officers moved in, arresting him for Clara Avery's murder. As he was led away in handcuffs, the icy calm that had once defined him cracked. For the first time, Drexler realized he had lost control. Granger stood outside the mansion, watching as Drexler was taken away. The case that had haunted Glacier Ridge for 15 years was finally coming to an end. Clara Avery's voice, silenced for so long, had finally been heard. But as Granger looked out over the frozen landscape, he knew one thing. Even in a town as cold and silent as Glacier Ridge, the truth could never stay buried forever. Simon Drexler's arrest sent shockwaves through Glacier Ridge. A man who had once seemed untouchable was now behind bars, facing charges for Clara Avery's murder and a web of other crimes that had come to light during the investigation. The town, long accustomed to silence, began to breathe again as secrets that had been buried for years were finally exposed. June Holloway and Harper Lindstrom were left to grapple with the truth. Their father, once a respected figure, had been involved in the dark dealings that led to Clara's death. June's decision to stay quiet had weighed on her for years, and now, with Drexler behind bars, the burden of guilt was even heavier. At Drexler's trial, the courtroom was packed with reporters and townspeople alike, all eager to witness the downfall of a man who had controlled so much from the shadows. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and it didn't take long for the jury to return a guilty verdict. Drexler was sentenced to life in prison, a fitting end for a man who had thought he could escape justice. For June and Harper, the case's resolution offered a chance for something they hadn't had in years: closure. Though their relationship would never be the same, they had faced the truth together, and in that there was a glimmer of healing. Glacier Ridge could finally move on. But the town, like the icy waters of Iceborne Lake, would never forget the body that had been hidden beneath the ice for so long. And that brings us to the end of the mystery in Glacier Ridge. After 15 years, the truth behind Clara Avery's death has finally come to light. But what do you think? Could there have been more to this story? Do you believe justice was truly served, or are there still secrets buried beneath the surface? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share it with others who love true crime, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next chilling tale. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.